Welcome to THA Talks, for free thought and open minds. Hello people, coming to you from London, UK and out to the universe. I'm Paul Obitelli and this is edition 46 of THA Talks, brought to you by Theo-Humanist Arts. Here at THA Talks we bring you weekly shows and all the best interviews we can get our sticky mitts on. Just go to www.thatalks.com to listen to or to download all our free content. Our talks include news, conspiracies, spirituality, the occult, science, history, art, philosophy, religion and much more. If you'd like to get hold of us or send us any of your thoughts or ideas for the show, maybe a request for a potential guest, you can do so by emailing info@thatalks.com. That's info@thatalks.com. Also, if you'd like to subscribe because you're enjoying the show, which we hope you are, you can do so by using our RSS feed or through various podcast directories like iTunes or Stitcher. You can visit our website for more details on that. Anyway, thanks for all those for tuning in again. It's great to see you all downloading the show. We've had a fantastic month, people linking the show, obviously spreading the word because it's definitely showed this month. And we're hoping to reward you with some fantastic guests arranged for the future. So we really are looking forward to some of the people we got coming on as we see the year out. But right now, I'm going to go to the other side of London for a surge and a surge and a surge and a surge from a dramaturge, David Parry.
And if, baby, I'm the bottom, you're the tops. Good evening, Mr. Obitelli. How are you? And I'm quite willing to admit I was bare-assed, butt naked last Sunday, but we'll leave it there.
You're teasing our guests now.
I am indeed, yes.
Well, let's move on, and because I think we're probably doing their heads in now. Well, this week we'll be welcoming back Anthony Peake to the show. Anthony is a researcher and a writer who studies the science of human consciousness beyond the physical brain. Anthony's just about to add to his 7 books with a new book that he worked on with Professor Ervin Laszlo called The Immortal Mind. I think a few of our listeners have been looking forward to this one, David.
He's a friend to us personally. He's a friend to the show. And yes, it's caused a stir already because he's a knowledgeable man and he's talking about very, very interesting subject areas.
Absolutely. And since the last show we did with him, we've had great reaction from our listeners, hence why he's back on. So let's crack on. Hello, Anthony. It's great to have you back on the show. How's it going?
It's going very well. It's great. I'm really pleased to be back on THA Talks as well. You know, it's really good, and I enjoyed our last chat. And I think we left an awful lot of things up in the air, so maybe this time we'll actually get the opportunity to carry them through. Yeah, there's certainly lots to talk about. And since the last show, basically we had a lot of listeners that were really, really enjoyed the show. And I found a lot of sort of people, I think edition 13 for our listeners, that's the last show we done with Anthony, and a lot of people that perhaps might have not been exposed to this kind of information did hear it and were very interested in it. I've been looking forward to getting you back on. So yeah, it is really good to have you on. I understand you've been working hard with Ervin Laszlo, and that book is basically due to release later this month. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah. The book is called The Immortal Mind, and for the first time I'm actually being published directly in America by the American publishing company Inner Traditions and Simon & Schuster. So it does give me a certain degree of exposure in America. The background to it is quite intriguing in the sense that Ervin Laszlo contacted me out of the blue to say that he was very keen to write a book with me. And to say I was flattered is an understatement, because many of your readers may be aware that Ervin Laszlo has been nominated for the Nobel Prize twice. He's an internationally known intellectual, an incredibly radical thinker, particularly his books on the Akashic field or the Akashic record. His book, Science in the Akashic Field, was a profound influence on my own writing as well. And Ervin said that he had a deal for a new book and he was very, very keen to co-author it with me, which was wonderful. We then embarked upon a sort of very fruitful relationship over a period of around about a year. The only drawback sometimes with writing a book with somebody else is that Ervin is actually based in Italy, and I'm over here in the UK, so sometimes actually writing a book together is somewhat difficult in the sense that you can't actually sit down over a few beers and actually decide which way the book's going to go. But the book is due to be out, I think I'm right in saying, at the end of October in America, and in the end of November in the UK.
What was Laszlo's main interest in what you were doing with this new book? What was his main focus of interest in the whole thing?
Well, I think Ervin has been interested in my work for a few years because there's a certain degree of synergy between what he's been writing about and what I've been writing about over the last 8 or 9 years, in the sense that both Ervin and myself are quite intrigued by the overlap between quantum physics. And by quantum physics, I mean real quantum physics. I don't mean the quantum physics that an awful lot of New Agers flap around with. I'm talking about the real deal, the real science. But the interface between that and consciousness. And indeed, if there are any kind of evidence to say that consciousness is in fact a field that exists outside of the brain, and the brain tunes in rather like a radio does into the consciousness field. Now, what Ervin was looking to do was to write a book in which we presented evidence that consciousness may exist outside of the brain, and with that evidence actually used to pull together a hypothesis which actually brings forward evidence that this may be the case. Now, Ervin is particularly interested in something called a zero-point field, which is a form of energy that exists between subatomic particles. Again, without going into the esoterica of this in terms of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, but in effect what science is discovering is that when we discuss the idea of empty space or a vacuum, indeed the idea that between subatomic particles there isn't anything, in fact it is actually full of energy, zero-point energy. And the zero-point field is what generates the zero-point energy, and that this field of energy is rather synonymous to a huge computer program, a huge computer database that effectively contains, encoded within it, everything that has ever happened and everything that potentially could happen. So in which case we attune into this huge field. It's rather like, I suppose, that we are sprites in a computer game, and Sprite exists within its own three-dimensional world, manipulated by the game player, but effectively the whole world that the Sprite exists within is generated by the computer program, by the binary information that is found on the CD-ROM. And within the binary information within the CD-ROM is the outcome of every decision that the Sprite can ever make, and indeed any decision that can ever be made within that particular universe. In which case this suggests that the universe is in fact digital, and in fact matter is not the final existence. Matter is not what is everything. In fact, everything is just information. And this is where Ervin and I have developed the book. We're actually looking for supporting evidence, simply the idea that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain is a very, very old-fashioned way of actually understanding the way nature works.
Yeah, I mean, going back to when you talked about empty space, I mean, I read somewhere about like the universe, basically, according to us and our so-called mainstream science viewpoints, that 95% of it doesn't actually exist. You know, we can't. It's what was the word they used? Black matter, dark matter. Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting because it's, especially from a skeptic's point of view, whether it's to do with the afterlife, ghosts, or here and there, they very much look for evidence to prove the existence of those phenomena. Whereas nowadays, with a lot of the work that people like yourself are doing, you can actually say, well, prove reality.
Well,
you know
that's
what I mean?
exactly it. I mean, one of the arguments I use, and I have used in my previous books, is we love labeling things. So in other words, we will label the idea of somebody has an unusual experience, and we label that and call that an hallucination. Of course, if you start looking into the word hallucination, you suddenly discover that, in fact, we don't actually understand what the word hallucination really means. It's a label. And in fact, Oliver Sacks, the world-famous psychiatrist, has recently written a book, strangely enough, entitled Hallucinations. And in this, he discusses how mysterious hallucinations are, because one could reasonably argue that external reality is an hallucination. And indeed, in my book, my last book, The Infinite Minefield, I argue that, in fact, the external world is an hallucination modulated by internally generated dimethyltryptamine in the brain. So what we have here is the idea that we believe that the external world is real because we believe it's real. It's what philosophers and consciousness studies people call naive realism, the idea that what you see is what's really out there. Now, anybody who actually knows anything about neurology and anybody that knows anything about consciousness studies will know that that is utterly ridiculous. The world we see out there is not the world as it really is. I've used the term in the past, electromagnetic chauvinism, the idea that because we perceive a tiny part of the electromagnetic spectrum, which we call visible light, and because all we're seeing is the visible light or the photons of a visible light bouncing off external objects, we therefore believe that what our eyes process is what is externally out there, which is not the case. So in which case we start to have to question exactly what is reality. I mean, for instance, there is what is extremely intriguing is that everything you are seeing now is actually being processed by the visual cortex of the brain, which sits at the back of the skull in an incredibly dark place. Now, the argument is, how do you see things? The light you are actually seeing now is not the light that's in the external world. The light you are seeing now in your mind's eye, which you take to be external reality, is created by the brain itself. It is actually developed from information, electrical impulses that are actually sent from the retina down the neurological pathways into the visual cortex, where it is recreated into an image. So clearly we are already creating our world around us. So people never think deeply enough about this. They tend to see things metaphorically and literally at face value. But there isn't a face value. All that is happening is we are perceiving the world in a particular way.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff can freak people out as well, because it kind of makes them think that, you mean what, everything I'm looking at isn't really there as I see it? And it's kind of it's a lot to take in and think about. And I personally think a lot of the mindset that skeptics come from is based on that fear, I think.
Well, one of the things is that skeptics will argue that people who are of our persuasion don't think deeply enough. In other words, we are not scientifically sophisticated enough to actually understand the mathematics. However, these people genuinely believe that the universe came out of a nanosecond, a femtosecond explosion, in which case, and then they actually suggest something called hyperinflation of the universe, that the universe expanded at trillions of times the speed of light in these first femtoseconds. Now, that as much to me is as a belief system as anything else is, in the sense that one of the major arguments of the scientific method is repeatability. In other words, they will argue that stuff like precognitions and such like are not true because they cannot be repeated in a laboratory. Yet I would counter the argument by saying nobody's actually repeated the Big Bang in a laboratory either, and yet everybody accepts the existence of the Big Bang. But they believe in such things as the idea that energy can be drawn up from nowhere. The idea of how energy works at its deepest levels is that effectively we borrow energy from somewhere that doesn't exist. Now, again, these things, I'm not saying these things are not true, but what I'm saying is they are just as crazy to believe as any of the beliefs of anybody who believes in precognition or telekinesis or any other extraordinary event. In fact, I would counter-argue to say that the evidence for telekinesis and precognition are far greater than the evidence that the Big Bang is as it's perceived. And I'm sure that people would criticize me about this, but if you actually look into the science of it, it's supposition. It hasn't been witnessed, it hasn't been seen. Just like nobody has ever seen a subatomic particle, because you can't see subatomic particles, because the wavelength of light is too large for light to be reflected off any of the subatomic particles. So when people turn around and say, I've seen photographs of atoms, No, you haven't. You've seen computer generations of regenerations of what an atom would look like. Not the same as actually saying nobody, anybody has ever seen an atom.
Yeah, and interesting when you brought up the free energy word. Then basically, I mean, I've often wondered. I suppose this is kind of leaning into the sort of conspiracy thing, but that if that free energy was really developed and brought into our lives, it could actually open a can of worms for a spiritual element, because that's the nature of the energy. It sort of goes into a different area, which asks big questions, so to speak. You know.
Oh, totally. I mean, 0-point energy is a phenomenon. I mean, effectively, has been known in its effect for many, many years. The question is exactly what is 0-point energy? And you touched upon one of the greatest mysteries, which is dark energy and dark matter, earlier on, when you mentioned about the existence of the fact that 94% of the universe is technically missing. And we know that dark energy exists because of certain effects that are seen around galaxies. We know that the way the galaxies function, there is clearly more mass in the universe than we're aware of. But this is, again, something we are considering exists because our present maths tells us, or our present science tells us it should exist. But sometimes I'm reminded of those old pictures by Heath Robinson, whereby our science is actually building itself castles in the air in order to explain the things we perceive, when in fact we should go back to square one and start rethinking our whole understanding of how the universe works.
Yeah, I mean, I know you're not really a conspiracy guy. You're very much with the facts and so on, which is what's good about your work. But I mean, when you talk about 0-point energy, is it possible that this could be the energy that a lot of people claiming are being used to create UFO, like flying saucers, and allowing them to power and obviously move in the way they are? From your perspective, could that be possible, even if it's just for military sort of technology?
Well, I suppose I'm of the opinion that UFOs as a phenomenon is far more complex than I'm very much of the Jacques Vallée school in terms of UFOs, in the sense that I think they are more related to perception and consciousness. Doesn't mean they don't exist. They don't exist. But what I'm saying is that they actually exist in this kind of netherworld, which can be linked to goblins and such like. In other words, it's part of the hyper-reality that we live within. In fact, I'm reminded of the work of somebody called Patrick Harper, who has written a series of books on this, and one of his famous books, Demonic Reality, where he suggests exactly this. And in fact, if you go back to the early works on ufology, I'm thinking of people like John Keel and Project Trojan Horse, whereby they're suggesting that the whole UFO phenomenon can be linked in a hyper-theory about the nature of reality. And I'm very much of that school, that we are just scratching the surface on a huge phenomenon, and UFOs are just part of it. I mean, UFOs' behavior, the way UFOs fly and the way they move, self-evidently, they cannot have physical passengers in there just because their bodies would be torn apart by the speed that they move. It doesn't mean that they don't move in these speeds, but they are working in a totally different reality field, different dimensional field than the way we perceive things.
Well, they're certainly not running on diesel engines, that's for sure.
Absolutely not.
No. David, I sense you eagerly awaiting to contribute to this one.
Yeah, a very mention of conspiracy, and I want to jump on everyone. You're quite right. Too many conspiracies, too much nonsense in the world. Deepak Chopra, of course, does not speak nonsense. What a great man. He was also talking about the Akasha recently in his feud with Richard Dawkins. In my view, he beat Dawkins hands down. Naive realism. What a waste of time, Anthony. What do you think? I assume you're aware of the work of Deepak Chopra.
I am, very much so. I think Deepak Chopra is much maligned, which I think is extremely unfair. Again, what takes place is that there's this demonization of individuals because they wish to think outside of normal ways of thinking, not, we argue about the idea of paradigm change. Now, effectively, whenever people have been on the leading edge, when a paradigm is starting to change, are ridiculed by the controllers of the present belief system. So, the Thomas Kuhn thesis of paradigm change.
Yeah.
Now, effectively, we are at the edge of a new paradigm change here. And effectively, what is happening is there are certain individuals who are starting to embrace the new paradigm and saying, okay, we have too many black swans around. Let's start thinking about a radical rethinking of how science works. This is not to say that that Newtonian physics and Einsteinian physics don't work, because they do. They work very, very effectively for 99% of perceived reality. However, they do not work in any shape or form for the building blocks of that reality. So here we have a mismatch, and all Deepak Chopra and his associates are doing are actually saying, look, we have too many black swans, too many white crows that are similar in many ways to 110 years ago when we had problems with black body radiation. Black body radiation did not fit the scientific paradigm of the late 19th century until Max Planck came along with his revolutionary idea that energy comes in quanta, and suddenly everything was suddenly answered. And I think it is similar now. We have too many issues at the moment in terms of how science works, and there are a lot of very, very brave people out there, and individuals like Richard Dawkins. And when it comes down to it, let we not forget, Richard Dawkins is not a physicist, he's a biologist. So effectively, he is fielding outside of his field, as it were. So in which case he's outside of his field in exactly the same way as many other individuals are. So to say that he is qualified to discuss issues that he's not qualified to issue, I think is fallacious thinking.
Well, I mean, that leads me into a number of areas. That's fascinating, Anthony. You're a good friend to this show, and we're becoming friends personally. I know Paul thinks the same. I'm on your side with UFOs. By the way, conspiracy listeners, I'm sympathetic to conspiracies, but let's not get carried away. That's all I'm saying. Strange powers that can only take forms that we would recognize as humans, because what else can they do? I want to take a few steps back from your forthcoming book. I mean, I would love you to come on the show again. I'm sure Paul would as well when it's actually launched. But I detect, certain areas that weren't addressed last time that lead directly to that project. Your masterly work on a mutual hero, Philip K. Dick.
Thank you.
What do you think? Well, it was very well written, Anthony, and he's a great man in his own right. And you took the bull by the horns. I was very, very impressed. Valis, vast, active, living intelligence system. I was going on about that book for years. I thought it was a masterpiece. I know I'm not alone in that, and that's from the world of literature. There are many, many serious writers and scholars who would agree with that. That's not a narrow or weird opinion. When I read that book, I thought, my God, what a pagan view of life. What a wonderful, interconnected, mystical view that he's trying to explain here. Do you think that has influenced your work, and what do you think of the idea of Valis?
Philip K. Dick has phenomenally influenced my work, probably more than any other writer. And what is amazing is that most people will know Philip K. Dick as a fiction writer. In fact, Ursula Gwynn was famously quoted as saying he's our homegrown Borges, because in many ways what he wrote was incredibly complex, very, very deep stories about the human relationship with external reality. Is external reality real? Is it what I perceive real? But what is greater from my own opinions of Philip K. Dick is that, having now written the biography, is that I am aware fully of the influences on him, and I know just how well read he was, what an amazing philosopher he was, and on top of that, how he was trying to write very, very deep, esoteric, mystical ideas within his novels. I mean, he was influenced by people like Jacob Boehme. He was influenced by he was Nietzsche, very, very deep thinkers, Schopenhauer. There's a whole list of philosophers that he was writing about. He was also fascinated by the Kabbalah. He was fascinated by the idea of Gnosticism, the idea that this universe is in fact a facsimile universe. It is a creation, and this has been created by the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, which the Gnostics called it. He was a fascinating man. And if you read sections of his exegesis, which was his analysis or his attempt to understand the events that took place in his life in February and March of 1974, is amazing. It's a cornucopia of wonderful ideas. Now, people will argue that Philip K. Dick was going mad. I would argue, no, he's not. He was going insane. What was happening was he was seeing through what he called the black iron prism of the reality we perceive, and was perceiving what he called the palm tree garden, which, of course, is going back to the analogies that people like William Blake used with his mind-forged manacles. You know, so effectively the reality we perceive is not the real reality, that we are being fooled into thinking this. And, of course, this, as you know, David, you know, as a person involved in esoteric traditions, you know perfectly well this is absolutely central to all esoteric traditions. Yeah. It's actually seeing the reality behind the reality.
Well, let me, I mean, that's very well said indeed, and thank you for that. What struck me about that particular novel, I'm an admirer of his work like you, Anthony, but there's a certain magic to that novel, was that he was trying to write theology using the terminology, and I did mean theology, the terminology of modern and futuristic science. Exactly what the Church Fathers would have done, of course, in their own day. So that caught my attention. Let me bounce you on to other novels of his, because I think you proved yourself as quite an authority on Philip K. Dick. Stories like Blade Runner, stories like Total Recall. What was the original? When Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep. That was...
The Blade Runner, yeah.
Yeah. I found those novels not as obsessively interesting as Valis, but nevertheless absolutely gripping. They all seem to me centered around notions of memory, notions of consciousness, notions of identity. And he seems to be saying, but we really don't know what these things are. You know, no matter how clever we become with manipulating our senses, manipulating information, these things remain mysterious. I mean, that reminds me very much of your work, Anthony. What do you want to say about that?
Well, I would think in many ways, I mean, Phil was writing philosophy in science fiction format. Again, rather like his hero Borges did. You know, it's the idea of you're putting forward very, very deep and meaningful philosophical ideas in what in many ways were potboiler novels. And effectively, I refer back to his novels that he wrote when he was, well, for most of his life, a struggling science fiction writer with very little money. He wrote novels that were of profound significance philosophically. Now, he couched it in science fiction language, but he talked about, as you quite rightly say, and I really totally agree with you on this, he was writing theology. For instance, the Divine Invasions. You know, the Divine Invasion, if you actually read the Divine Invasion, it is a profoundly theological book. It is the idea that there is a God, and God is suffering from amnesis in the sense he has forgotten he is God, and therefore thinks himself as a normal human being. Now, there are very, very, you know, when you talk about the ideas of panpsychism and such like, you have the idea that is God within us all, and again, this is a pagan belief system, isn't it? Yeah. The idea that we are collectively one single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, as the American comedian Hicks said. Now, Philip K. Dick came up with this idea many, many years ago, and I'm perfectly aware of the fact that he's not the original thinker on panpsychism. Of course he isn't. But what he was doing was he was writing about the idea that we have forgotten our own divinity. He also argued that there is within us all this spark of the divine, something that is entrapped within the body, that is part of what the Gnostics would call the pleroma, the place behind. Now, in his novel, The Cosmic, I think it was called The Cosmic Potboiler. I can never remember the name of that entirely correctly. I mean, this was very much applying Zoroastrianism, it was implying the Kabbalah, and the idea that everything is entrapped within physical presence. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but in that novel, he put forward some very, very interesting ideas that in his later life he really pursued. And it was the idea, again, what I touched upon earlier, that we are trapped in some kind of supercomputer program. And I'm reminded of his 2 or 3 times attempted written novel, The Owl in Daylight. And in this, and what a wonderful line, it's typical Philip K. Dick, The Owl in Daylight. The idea that an owl is a nocturnal animal, it perceives the world in darkness, and when you place it into daylight, it is blinded by the information field it receives. Now again, this is again the idea of what esoteric traditions have been doing for centuries, is actually opening our minds up to the real field of information. And Phil was amazing. You touch upon Valis. You know, to me, Valis was so powerful on so many levels, because there's a novel within the novel. You probably recall there's the movie sequence where there's the David Bowie character. There is the Sophia, the idea of the Shekinah presence, the idea of the divine feminine, which is inside the movie, the young child that gets killed. But there is so much in that book. It is powerful beyond anything. I've read it 3 or 4 times now. And at the end of the book, he has his Tractatus, where he actually suggests that we are DNA is what is driving us. We are plasmates. We are a life form that's actually trapped within the physical presence. Amazing stuff. Amazing stuff.
Well, I mean, I hate us getting sort of mutually, turning into a mutual glee club on this show, but it happens sometimes. There we are. And I'm very grateful for your flattering review of my forthcoming book, Deconstructing Mount Athos. It
was wonderful, David. It was absolutely wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And effectively, as somebody that's fascinated by Greek Orthodoxy, somebody who's fascinated by the whole Orthodox diaspora and everything else, but it was the way you actually developed the idea, and you carried it through magnificently. And that's not just words. It really is a magnificent book.
Thank you. Thank you very much, my friend. I mean, I needed to say that because panpsychism, of course, was developed as an idea by people with genuine ingenuity like Soloviev. And I'm a firm believer there's genuine and real ingenuity in so much of your work. I mean, it staggers me sometimes that you're not better known than you are, but I'm sure our little show will do its best to help support you, and you've got our personal support anyway. I'm saying that because one of the ideas I sense within your work, which comes from that particular world, was the idea that human beings aren't really lots of different people in a species, but they're aspects, they're cells within one being. The one being humanity, which some of the mystics, let's say the Kabbalists, call Adam Kadmon, blah, blah, blah. I sense that idea emerging and re-emerging in your work, particularly maybe as it's beginning to come out in your recent writings. What do you think of it, Anthony?
I agree with you totally, completely, 100%. I consider my writing to be my own journey, as most writers do. In other words, my first book was very much me trying to understand me within the universe. And it's something that's always intrigued me, as it would do with any thinking human being. The idea of why am I a sentient consciousness awash in this world of inanimate matter? And why am I here? Now, one could argue that is being incredibly vain in the sense of why should I wish to understand greater issues when in fact all I am is a link in a genetic chain, and all I am is a tool for DNA, as Richard Dawkins would argue. But to me, these big questions have been part of my life since childhood. And when I started writing my books, I had no idea which route I would take. Indeed, I didn't even believe that a publisher would ever be interested in publishing my work. And when Arcturus came along and actually said that they were desperate to publish my first book, I was flattered beyond anything I can imagine. Now, since then, my ideas have spread out, whereas initially the whole cheating the ferryman concept that was in the first book has now expanded out, as you rightly say, into this far wider more all-encompassing Uber theory of exactly what consciousness is within reality. And I'm coming to the conclusion, as a lot of thinkers have done in the past, and clearly you have, is that, in fact, the whole idea that we are a single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively is immensely powerful. And I'm reminded of the work of various writers on this. I mean, we are not alone in writing about this. But effectively, I think we are now in the opportunity, we have the science now, to start understanding how maybe DNA itself is sentient, and that it is DNA that is in fact driving all these things. And in my last book, The Infinite Minefield, I present an argument to say that this is very much the case, and that we are starting to awaken to the fact of our own inner divinity, in the sense that we are waking up. But the curiosity, David, here is that we are now existing in a world that seems to be falling in on itself, and it seems to be actually going through this tremendously difficult phase where we're reverting to fundamentalism here, there, and everywhere. We're moving away from spirituality into doctrinaire belief systems, intolerant belief systems. And I wonder sometimes whether this is part of the birth pains of something new, maybe.
What a wonderful
What's your
thought.
thoughts on that?
I agree with you 100%, by the way, and I think we need a long talk either on the podcast or just privately or maybe both about that. I agree with you 100% on that. I know Paul is desperate to get back in.
Absolutely. I was feeling we were leaving Paul out. Sorry, Paul, we must revert back.
And I apologize,
No worries.
my honoured friend, but there's one last thing I want to throw at you, Anthony. I think most of my pagan brothers and sisters, Paul included, knows that I'm not one of the greatest fans of Aleister Crowley.
Yeah.
I tend to think he's a problem for modern paganism more than a blessing. And it also strikes me that he's become this sort of weird hippie icon that a posh kid at Cambridge in those days simply would not have been. But there's one experience that certainly did catch my attention that it refers to. He was napping one afternoon, and he suddenly caught himself thinking, when I was Oliver Cromwell, he suddenly woke up and thought that was the most pivotal mystical experience of his life. What do you think of that?
I think it would be the argument that he was tuning into what Ervin Laszlo would term the Akashic field. And the idea that, for instance, one of my arguments is about reincarnation, that people misinterpret reincarnation and see it as a personal thing. Whereas I'm very much, the Buddhist school that effectively, we are impersonal in that sense. And in which case he was attuning into the collective consciousness of history and attuning himself there. I mean, I have difficulties. Again, I'm rather similar to yourself in terms of Crowley, in the sense of an awful lot of what he wrote was self-evident nonsense. But his concept of AWAS and, of human duality and mental duality. And of course, he was exaggerating himself. He was playing up to being the most evil man in the world, and that's what he loved doing.
Yeah.
So one has to assume, that he got caught into this self-image and he couldn't escape from it.
Yeah.
But I'm more intrigued in terms of one of the groups that really love my work, and in fact were probably one of the first esoteric groups to take on my work and invite me to talk to me, were the Servants of the Light. And Dolores Thastroff Nowicki and her associates. And again, they again were coming along this school. I mean, they're from Israel Regardie, aren't they? And individuals like that, and Dion Fortune. Mm-hmm. And again, they said to me, all you're doing is writing deep esoteric truths that have been known by the esoteric traditions for years. But what you're doing is you're actually putting the science veneer around it, which was a wonderful compliment. And I do thank Dolores for that.
Well, Anthony, as I say, I hate the show turning into a glee club, but your work is groundbreaking, it's crisp, it's ingenious, it's innovative, and you are putting deep ancient truths into a modern vocabulary. Much more power to your elbow. Paul, you can beat me when we're in Budapest. I apologize. The floor is yours.
No, as usual, all interesting stuff. Regarding Crowley, I think it's important to separate. You got the man, and then you've got the work. So I think that's a bit of an issue with Aleister Crowley there. Also, I think it would be really cool if Anthony, if you did do more talks at pagan events or occult events, because I think that your work does complement it. It's just interesting relating it to a lot of those kind of things.
No. As far as I'm concerned, I consider that all philosophical groups, as far as I'm concerned, because I think there's a unity of ideas. I think we're all struggling to understand our role in the universe, and I don't dismiss any systems at all, and I'm more than happy, because I like to be inclusive, because I want to learn from other people, and the only way I can learn from other people is interfacing with them, sort of discussing their ideas with them. So I have no objection to that at all.
Well, as I say, I think it would be really cool, and David and I could certainly point you in the right direction of the kind of places that you go down really well at, you know. I understand you've also recently been to Paris to do a TV documentary, which sounds really interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah,
it's a TV documentary by a guy called Dennis Delestrac. And Dennis Delestrac is one of the world's top documentary makers. He's done a series of documentaries. For instance, he did a documentary called Sand Wars about the way in which sand is now becoming the new water in terms of a resource, and the way that literally wars will start over sand, which I won't go into details about, but it is fascinating because we have certain assumptions of sand that we don't necessarily understand. There's only certain types of sand, for instance, that can actually be made into concrete. Therefore, the sand in the desert is not the right kind of sand. It's only beach sand. He's also done a documentary on the mysteries of the Nile, where he was involved in a group of individuals who kayaked down from the source of the Nile down to Alexandria. So, and Port Said, I don't know, I think it's Alexandria. But effectively, he's a fascinating guy, and he approached me around about 3 or 4 months ago to say they were halfway through a documentary for French and German television. Now, this is not a documentary they were pitching to French and German television. It's a documentary that has been commissioned by French and German television on the influences of Philip K. Dick. And one of his associates, a very famous French intellectual, came across my book on Philip K. Dick, and he literally said, "Stop the presses. We've got to stop, and we've got to interview this guy, because this guy is actually saying some revolutionary things that are completely different to a lot of what other people have been writing about Philip K. Dick." So they invited me over to Paris about 6 weeks ago, and I was interviewed in TV studios in Paris. And I'm now informed that I'm now all over the movie, because they've actually segued what I've said into various sections of the movie. And they interview people like Tessa Dick, who I've interviewed, Rutger Hauer, various other people that were involved in the movies, because they want to really bring in a movie that really gets the ideas and the power of Philip K. Dick's thoughts. And I think this movie, I've seen certain sections of it, and it is incredible. It's going to be in English, so all the interviews are in English, but the quality and the production values of it is a stunning visual. And I'm absolutely so excited to be involved in such a project. This will really put Philip K. Dick on the map. It really will.
Well, it sounds like something we should all check out. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I've had in my notes here, I've had quite a blatant question to ask you. How close do you think we are then with science in proving that there's life or experiences after death?
I think that the problem is proving something like that scientifically, because the scientific method doesn't lend itself to proof of such things, because science believes in repeatability. You know, the question I said earlier, because cosmology does not, whereas physics and science does. So therefore, to prove life after death, you'd have to come up with something really, really powerful. Now, I've been thinking about this philosophically for quite a few years, and I wonder whether we will ever discover proof of life after death? Because are we supposed to discover life after death? Because if we did, it would cause, because by training I'm a sociologist. I mean, my degree is in sociology. So therefore, social cohesion depends upon the idea that we have a mortal life and we are born and then we die. If there is suddenly then the discovery that there is life after death and that this is just a very small part of a much larger megaverse and our lives are just part of a huge megaverse, that would cause all kinds of problems for social cohesion. It would cause all kinds of problems for religions, because suddenly, which religion is right in terms of life after death? So there may be certain rules and regulations that we are not supposed to discover these kind of things. However, there is certain powerful evidence that suggests, and it's one of the things I discuss in my books, is that we're getting it wrong here. We use the term life after death. Now, the term before and after suggests temporal flow. It suggests time. Therefore, there is a before and after. Whereas I believe the reality of the situation is it's time itself that is the illusion. It is time that we die in time. If we are outside of time, we never die. Again, using Philip K. Dick's idea, Philip K. Dick had a concept called orthogonal time. Again, not unique. There were other philosophers that had come up with similar ideas. But effectively, he argued that there's a linear flow from the past to the future, but within each second or millisecond or whatever of time, there is another time that runs orthogonally away from that time. So in other words, our lives, we see our lives as being in time, whereas in fact our actual whole life is outside of time. There is a concept in Hinduism called the Lengsariya, the long body. And how I'd analogize this is that you, myself, David, and all the listeners here, we all see ourselves as being us now. But of course, we are us as we were children. We are us as we will be in the future. I look different now to the way I looked when I was 17. I will look different when I'm 80. But it's still me. And the thing that is consistent is my conscious awareness. Now, what happens is that entity travels through time. Now, imagine if you had a time-lapse camera that the shutter speed was 75 years. If you had that, you wouldn't be you now. You would be an image, like a long worm, that starts very small, gets bigger, and then slowly gets smaller again as you get older. That is the real you. All you are is an instant snapshot. Now, again, people will say, is this scientific? And I'll turn around to my critics and I'll say, read Minkowski. And Hermann Minkowski was the teacher of Albert Einstein. And Minkowski had what he called block time. The idea that just because our critical fusion facility of our eye is 20th of a second or something, we believe that is what time is. If my critical fusion facility of my eye was a minute, the world would look totally different. But it's my subjective worldview. Am I making sense here?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah.
So in which case, it's time that is the anomaly here. It is time that we are fooled by. So in which case we never die, because we die in time. You will never die in your universe. Now again, my critics will turn around and say, utter nonsense. And I'll turn around to them and say, let's look at the work of people like Max Tegmark. Max Tegmark is one of the world's most authoritative particle physicists. Last time I checked, he was at Princeton. Max Tegmark has what he calls the quantum suicide experiment. And he applies the actual known things about quantum physics, and he applies something called Schrodinger's cat, or the Schrodinger's cat mystery, to an individual standing in front of a machine gun that has a 50-50% of firing or not firing. He argues that from the viewpoint of the person who is standing in front of him in the machine gun will never fire, because you create your own universe. You collapse the wave function of your universe, which is part of the Akashic field, the Akashic record, and you are continually collapsing the statistical chance of a particle being in one place or another is actually made into a point particle by the act of observation. Some people would argue the act of measurement. But effectively, it means that reality is created by the observation of a conscious being, which means that this universe is your universe. You are within your own computer program, and you are collapsing the information field. Again, people will argue and say, well, where is the science of this? And I would say, look at the latest work of Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking recently wrote a paper where he was discussing a thought called the top-down hypothesis of quantum physics, which he wrote with a person called Hertog, who is a research scientist at CERN. He argued that the future contains every possible outcome of every event. The point that you choose in your actions collapses all those possibilities into one reality. And you do that every time you make a decision. You are creating this universe, but it doesn't mean that you're alone, because we are a collective consciousness experiencing it all. We're all one consciousness collapsing the wave function of this universe. So in other words, external reality is an illusion created by all of us. And we consensually agree to that universe being the way it is. This is why collective delusions take place. You know, when people at Lourdes saw the sun spin in the sky, it is because everybody in that crowd saw that and collectively created it. And they all saw it. Now, this is why people see UFOs the way they do. This is why people see ghosts. This is why people see what they want to believe. This is why people who have particular religious beliefs are vindicated. Their beliefs are vindicated by everything they see, because they're creating the reality around them which supports their belief system. Once we break out of this realization that we are creating this together is when we'll be able to start manipulating reality as you can do in a lucid dream, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. That's deep stuff as well. So, you know, that's very interesting. We are pressing towards the end now. So, David, have you got anything else you'd like to pass on to Anthony?
Well, I mean, we need him back on this show again and again and again, don't we? The man's a mine of information. There are so many things I want to talk to you about, Anthony. It's untrue. Paul was talking about hooking you up with pagan conferences, and we must do. But Paul and I also need to sit down and actually arrange something where we share a platform. That is under discussion. This year's been a strange year. Everything's sort of pushed into next year. But that is still on the cards, Anthony, and we want you there. I mean, let me just end with a couple of thoughts. I mean, as you two were speaking a moment ago, I remembered that wonderful stage show that was made into a film. They shoot horses, don't they?
Oh yes, about the dancers in the 1920s.
Yeah, and of course, when the young man actually shoots the young girl, she falls into a scented garden forever without actually knowing that she's been shot. She goes to paradise in her own way. I thought that was reminiscent of that. Science. Oh, there's too much said about science in this modern deluded age. Science can only weigh and measure, and it observes as it will. There was a wonderful joke at the expense of science in The Madness of King George, where someone brings one of the pots of the king's urine, and the urine is actually blue. And I think it's the physician royal refuses to look at it and says, well, it's all based on observation. Obviously, we're leading up to your next appearance, for want of a better word, on our show, Anthony. The Philip K. Dick material obviously leads to your new book. I believe the working title, or the actual title, was Personal Immortality, The Persistence of Consciousness.
Correct.
That in itself, I find incredibly evocative. Certainly if we're looking at the world's great religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, maybe certain traditions in our own part of the world, most people were not looking really at the survival of personal consciousness per se. The whole idea of reincarnation was there was something developing like a grain of sand in an oyster, there wasn't actually a person, a soul, a spirit that was fully formed. That was in the process of making. I mean, the Victorians used to talk about this world as the veil of soul making. So one day you would be a person in your own right, but let's not get hysterical. At the moment, most people are not. Therefore, the Vikings used to think of great priests or warriors as actually going to Valhalla, actually going to the lands of light, but most people simply didn't. There wasn't enough of them to actually be present in those other worlds. What do you think of that, Anthony? Is that too pessimistic, or is that sort of really this type of process philosophy that, again, I sense within a lot of your work?
I think it's a very interesting point, that, and has me thinking away 10 to the dozen about the idea of when we talk about personal immortality and the idea of will I be me when and if there is something that survives when my body disappears. But of course I would argue that your body doesn't disappear because you fall out of time. So therefore you never reach the point of your death, because that happens in the future, which doesn't exist in your phaneron, doesn't exist in your worldview, because you never get to that point. So it's the idea of, if you move on, do you move on as you? But I suppose you is an interesting term, in the sense that I am made up of all my thoughts, my fears, my experiences over my 60 years of life. And I remember them, and I have defined myself by that. But as the Buddhists say, when you actually start to look internally to find the processor that is processing the information, the thing that is actually feeding off the memories and is understanding the world, you suddenly discover that it's a void. I'm reminded of the book, and I can't off the top of my head now think of the name of the author, but he was a mountaineer who one day was looking out over the vast distances, and he suddenly realized that he'd spent all of his life realizing he didn't have a head. And this is very true, because we perceive the world looking out, and we see our body, but in normal, non-mirrored, non-reflected world, we're headless. There is this kind of space which is above our body, and this space is where you are. Now, this is a very simple idea, but a very profound one.
Yeah.
And it's the idea of exactly what I am, what makes me me. And I've spent most of my life trying to understand this, and I'm still not entirely sure. So when we say personal immortality, the suggestion is that when we move on, there will be a vestige of me that remembers I'm me in some way, in some other place, which means continuity. But then again, if you think about it philosophically, we have spent all our lives reading books, amassing information, having experiences, for it all to just be washed away. And this is the enigma of reincarnation, isn't it? That effectively, if I'm reincarnated as somebody else and I completely forget, I drink of the river Lethe, and the Lethe wipes away all my memories, and I'm reborn again as somebody else, there's no learning there. You can only learn by your experiences. So there has to be a personal memory of the errors you made in your past life that you can carry forward in some way. So there has to be an internal memory. And I argue in my books, as you probably know, that internal memory that carries through all those lives is the daemon, the inner self, the higher self.
Oh, Anthony, I remember reading that book years ago. What was it on? Having No Head?
Oh, yes.
And thinking, well, I can't remember the author either of it.
Neither can I.
Remarkable.
It's really annoying me.
Yeah. But, your own work is remarkable in its own right. And I cannot wait for the launch of this new book.
Just to let you know that there is a new book after that as well. Oh. I've already started research on a book called Opening the Doors of Perception.
Oh.
Which will be my book for 2016, which I'll be working on next year, which I already have signed a book deal for. So that will be the next project. So there's book 9 due out in 2016.
Anthony, every blessing. And as I say, we must meet up for that pint very, very soon.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it has been great having you back on again. Been looking forward to it, and definitely look forward to doing it again. Is there anything you'd like to let us know or our listeners know about before we wrap this one up?
No, I'd just like to thank both you guys for actually having me on the show again. I always found this one of the most intellectually stimulating shows I do when I do interviews, because we're allowed to free associate and really think the ideas through. And I always feel that we run out of time because there's so many areas we can follow. But really, thank you very much for listening. And to the listeners, do check out my work. You might find it intriguing. Hopefully you do. I write for you and I write for me, because we're effectively all trying to understand why we are here.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that was the return of Anthony Peake. Another intriguing chat there, David.
Well, Paul, I think we need him if he's willing to be a regular contributor to the talks. His whole enterprise, it seems to me, is to put ancient mystical ideas that have proved at least generating the imagination, new thoughts, new ideas, generative in all sorts of levels, into a modern scientific language. I find that incredibly exciting. He's also trying to look at how far these things can go within that context, and how maybe sometimes what they're saying simply can't be weighed, measured, or justified at all. It's simply there. What a fine mind he's got.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is with anything like involved with science, and that normally you're beaten with a stick every time you venture off a certain expectation of how you should be thinking and what you should be researching. And it's good that people like Anthony are thinking for themselves and doing it. And he mentioned himself his critics. I'm sure he's got a lot of skeptics that are attacking his work, but the bottom line is it's so potent. It is really there. You got all right. It's a little bit like what he was saying about the proving life after death. No, you can't prove hands down that there's life after death, and perhaps we're not meant to prove it because it would be a pretty major discovery. But what he does do with some of his work is he presents that it could be very, very possible that there is. It's one of those things, and as I said at the beginning of the show, it's got to the stage now where the people saying, "Well, prove it. Where's the evidence?" And what you can do now is reverse it and say, well, what we can do is say, well, prove the reality, because what we have discovered now is the reality is not as scientific as you once thought. So it's mind-boggling stuff, but yeah, it is really cool.
Well, you see, I think there's too much science fantasy in the West at the moment. Science was never designed to answer those questions. There are no tools by which it could answer those questions. It isn't even possible. Skeptics want science to be a belief system. The minute it's a belief system, hey, it's not science. Science is designed to ask questions about the world. The minute we get beyond the world, by definition, it can't answer those questions.
Well, we have words like phenomenon, mystery, paranormal. These are words that have just been created to address certain things, situations, occurrences that science can't completely prove. So,
yeah, but as I say, Paul, it wasn't designed ever to do that.
Yeah, that's it.
I think there's a certain mythology that surrounds science these days, which is really unfortunate. Science is a wonderful, profound and important thing, but nobody ever said it could do things like that. Yeah. Nobody.
Okay, well, coming up, we've got Prakash Adashra, who's going to come on and talk to us about ancient Indian astrology. We've got Mark Wolf, a follower of Asatru. We're going to indulge in a good few subjects with Mark. He's actually been listening to our show quite a lot, and he's an author, and we'll be indulging in a lot of conversation in that one. We've also got Jordan Maxwell coming on the show, which that should be very interesting. Lon Milo Duquette, who's going to come on and talk about Aleister Crowley, the OTO, and Tracy R. Twyman. Met lots of great guests coming back on the show and appearing on the show for the first time. So we've also got a few people we're speaking with, but we'll keep our lips zipped for now. But it's all looking good, isn't it, David?
People will be shocked at some of our potential guests if we manage to get them.
Thank you for tuning in. We'll look forward to the next one. David and I are going to take a short break now to Budapest to chill for a few days and enjoy a few cold beers out there. And we'll look forward to coming back and speaking to you all then. Till next time, guys. Take care. Bye.
Chowsy, chowsy.